17 families vanished, no bodies, no blood, just gone, and all of them had spoken to one man the night before, Professor Ezekiel Drummond. What if I told you that a single man in 1824 unlocked a method of control so powerful the human mind couldn't resist it, that entire families walked barefoot into the freezing woods of Massachusetts, smiling, never to be seen again? That's not folklore, that's history your textbooks left out. Hadley was a town that thrived on logic, order, community, a farming jewel of the Connecticut Valley, and yet, something rotten had taken root in its core, not in the soil, not in the sky, but in the mind of a man who knew how to whisper past your defenses. You've been taught that evil wears a mask, snarls with fangs, kicks down your door in the night. But what if true evil wore spectacles, spoke softly, graded essays and poured tea with trembling precision? What if it invited itself into your home by invitation? Ezekiel Drummond was not a killer in the traditional sense. His weapons weren't blades or guns, they were ideas, words, observations so intimate, so surgical, they could cut the will out of a man without breaking skin. He didn't murder. He harvested. The records still exist, but they're buried under layers of revision, bureaucratic ash, and academic censorship. You weren't supposed to know his name. You were never meant to hear about what he discovered beneath the polite facade of Hadley's upper class, or how many of them begged him to go deeper. Because once you hear it, truly hear it, something inside you changes. You begin to recognize how fragile you really are, how easily your thoughts can be bent by those who understand the levers of the soul. This is not entertainment, this is a descent into the science they dared not name, a descent into a man who could unmake identity, a descent into what happens when control isn't taken, but given. Welcome to the story of Professor Ezekiel Drummond. And once we begin, there is no going back. Hadley wasn't a town, it was a facade. A picturesque shell made of white-painted churches, cobblestone streets, and polite Sunday gatherings, but underneath, always underneath, was tension, rigid moral codes, stifling order, fear of disgrace wrapped in civility, and in this pressure cooker, Ezekiel Drummond didn't stand out. He blended in perfectly. He arrived with polished boots, Latin letters of introduction, and a tone of voice so composed it made men second-guess their own instincts. He was exactly what the town craved, order, wearing a human face. They didn't know that behind his silver eyes he was already studying them, not just the boys he taught, but the fathers, the mothers, the rhythms of every household on King Street, who obeyed without question, who harbored silent rebellion, who were ripe. That was the word he used in his private notebooks, ripe. You see, Drummond didn't care about education. He cared about compliance. He didn't teach literature. He decoded reactions. He didn't assign essays. He mapped emotional triggers. And when he walked the streets at night, that leather journal in his hand, he wasn't strolling. He was constructing a model, a living model of collective behavior, down to the rhythms of laughter in family parlors and the subtlest hesitation in a father's tone when disciplining his son. He logged it all, methodically, coldly. That fifth-place setting on the Chamberlain's table, that wasn't a mystery. It was a summoning. Hadley's people believed they were free, but their choices were already being made for them beneath their awareness, in the pauses between Drummond's questions, in the subtle praise he used to guide them. He didn't need to command anyone. He simply made obedience feel inevitable. There is a point in every man's life, though few recognize it, when their thoughts stop being their own, when they begin to align with a pattern they didn't create, but one they now defend. This is psychological architecture, the kind that bypasses resistance. And Drummond was a master architect. That's why no doors were broken in Hadley, why no bodies were dragged, why 17 families didn't run. They walked, smiling, peaceful, into the deep cold. Because when the right words are whispered in the right mind, even annihilation can feel like enlightenment. This wasn't hypnosis, it was conversion. And Hadley was only the test. There's a reason Drummond never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Because his true power wasn't volume, it was rhythm. Language to him was architecture, And just like the Roman columns he lectured about in moral philosophy, he knew how to build sentences that stood inside people, that lingered long after the conversation ended, that echoed in the silence of a man's own thoughts until they didn't feel foreign anymore. His students never noticed it at first. How could they, when the praise was gentle and the questions thoughtful and the criticism so elegantly wrapped in compliments that it felt like self-discovery? But in their journals, those daily confessions Drummond insisted they keep, he wasn't just reading their words. He was studying breakpoints. He was mapping identity. Each entry revealed fault lines: shame, hunger, resentment, father wounds, guilt, longing. And once he knew those fractures, he didn't fill them. He pressed them. Imagine being 16 and alone in your thoughts, and your headmaster says, "I read your observation on Cicero's exile, but tell me, why do you always mention punishment when discussing justice?" It sounds innocent, but it's a wedge. A splinter of self-doubt inserted gently into the core of a boy's worldview. Do this enough, and the subject begins to question every instinct, until they crave your voice to know what's real, until they stop asking if you're right, and only ask how to please you. That's not education, that's erasure. And Drummond didn't limit this to his students. No, he expanded. Remember those evening walks? That wasn't idle curiosity. That was data collection. He knew which mothers avoided their husband's touch after church, which boys flinched when their fathers raised their voice, which families sat in silence too long at dinner. Then he'd bring it up in casual conversation days later, never directly, always wrapped in polite inquiry. "Does Sarah seem more withdrawn lately? I wonder if Thomas's recent arithmetic errors suggest something troubling at home." It was always just enough to unsettle, just enough to introduce a question. Because once you question yourself, he doesn't have to convince you of anything. You'll do the rest. That's how it works. Not through domination, but through disintegration. Hadley didn't know it, but they weren't being taught. They were being reprogrammed, and by the time they noticed, it was already too late. The Chamberlains were not chosen by accident. They were the perfect specimen, respected, admired, stable, Hadley's model family. And precisely for that reason, Ezekiel Drummond selected them as his first collective subject. You see, when a man wants to test control, he begins with the broken. But when he wants to prove a system, he targets the unbroken. And the Chamberlains were whole, functional, proud. Samuel ran a thriving business, and Mercy was a pillar of charity. Their children were bright, happy, unscarred. So how do you make a family like that walk willingly into oblivion? Simple. You shift their center of gravity. It began in small ways. Drummond started tutoring Benjamin personally, far beyond the curriculum. Long private meetings, quiet philosophical riddles, questions that peeled away the layers of the boy's certainty. Does your father love justice or obedience? Would you lie to protect your family or speak truth and dishonor them? Harmless on the surface, but every question was a seed, seeds that grew into silence. Benjamin changed first. He spoke less at dinner, his eyes drifted. He stopped correcting his younger siblings' Latin, his smile dulled, and when asked if something was wrong, he only said, "Professor Drummond says the world is layered. I'm just learning to see deeper." Then came the visits. Drummond stopped by the Chamberlain house once, twice a week. Always invited, always polite, always asking brilliant, thoughtful questions. He would praise Samuel's business acumen, then quietly imply that free markets were illusions of control. He'd admire Mercy's charitable spirit, then gently suggest that suffering was necessary to purify the soul. And through it all, he was never rude, never forceful. He simply introduced doubt into every certainty they held. By the second month, Mercy's charitable meetings had stopped. Samuel began skipping church. Sarah's music fell silent, and little Thomas, once the loudest voice in the house, had begun whispering his thoughts into a small black notebook Drummond had gifted him. Do you see what he did? He didn't break them. He shifted them. He inverted the family's internal compass. until what had once grounded them, ritual, love, logic, now felt like weight. Drummond was their new anchor. And when the time came to leave, they didn't resist. They welcomed it. Because when you remove a person's inner north, any direction feels right. January brought more than snow. It brought compliance. Not through force, not through fear, but through resonance. By the third week of the new year, the town had started to shift. It wasn't loud. There were no riots, no screams, just subtle deviations in routine. Families forgot to attend church. Children stopped playing in the fields. The innkeeper on King Street boarded up without explanation, and in every case, the same pattern emerged. Each household had recently interacted with Professor Drummond. He didn't visit everyone. He didn't need to. He only had to touch the right minds, the ones that others listened to, the opinion formers, the emotional conduits. Once infected, they'd carry his message without knowing they were messengers. That's the brilliance of psychological contagion. It doesn't spread by word. It spreads by vibration. One mother begins speaking slower, more solemnly. Her children mimic the tone. Her neighbor feels the shift and mirrors it in conversation. Within a week, the collective rhythm of the community bends. This wasn't random. It was engineered. Drummond had studied ancient doctrines of group influence. From Roman theater design to tribal chant, he understood what modern science wouldn't name until a century later: entrainment, the phenomenon of multiple individuals unconsciously synchronizing to the dominant emotional frequency in their environment. He became that frequency. In his presence, time felt slower, minds grew still, internal dialogue softened, and what replaced it was his voice. By mid-January, a strange calm blanketed Hadley. It wasn't peace. It was sedation. The blacksmith stopped hammering. The baker stopped singing. The town, once noisy with laughter and livestock, became muted. And yet no one raised the alarm. Because Drummond had taken one final step. He installed ritual. He began weekly reflection séances at the academy, voluntary of course, gentle meditations, quiet group readings. He called it the study of interior order. But those who attended, students and parents alike, reported vivid dreams, sleepwalking, lost time. Still they returned. Even when they awoke with scratches they didn't remember. Even when their thoughts no longer felt like their own. Because Drummond never demanded obedience. He made you crave it. He made it feel sacred. And Hadley, under its blanket of snow, was now a temple. A quiet sanctuary to a god of soft domination. The Whitlock family never made it through February. They weren't as respected as the Chamberlains, but they were visible. Nathaniel Whitlock was the town's postmaster, a role that made him indispensable. Hadley's lifeline to the outside world. His wife, Margaret, was known for her sharp tongue and unflinching honesty. If there was one family unlikely to vanish quietly, it was theirs. And yet, one night, they did. There was no warning, no disturbance. Nathaniel closed the post office at dusk, as he always did. Margaret was seen sweeping her porch just after dark, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. Their 2 daughters were heard playing in the upstairs bedroom, shrieking with laughter. By dawn, the house was silent. Neighbors noticed first. The shutters were open, though a storm had raged all night. Nathaniel was meticulous about closing them. When Constable Brewster arrived, the front door stood unlocked, the hearth burned out. Inside, the scene was identical to the Chamberlain home, untouched, orderly, except for the table. Another 5th place setting, another invitation for a guest that had already arrived. And like the Chamberlains, the Whitlocks had left their boots, coats, gloves, all the clothing that would have kept them alive in the snow. Barefoot prints led straight into the frozen forest. This time, though, there was something else. Blood. Not much, just a smear on the banister, as though someone had slipped while descending the stairs. But it was enough to terrify the search party. Drummond, of course, was present. He always was, calm, observant, offering logical explanations. Margaret may have injured herself before leaving, he suggested softly. It doesn't mean foul play." The men nodded, relieved to have someone intellectual in the room, but Brewster watched him carefully. He'd begun to notice how Drummond seemed to materialize at every crisis, offering comfort, answers, order, always order. And yet, no one questioned it, because Drummond's presence soothed the panic. His voice slowed their hearts. His explanations felt reasonable. But there was something in his eyes that night, something that unsettled even Brewster. A flicker of satisfaction. Hadley was unraveling, family by family, and though the constable didn't yet understand how, he sensed a pattern. But patterns mean nothing if you can't act. And Brewster, like the others, found himself hesitating. Because deep down, a question had begun to form in his mind. What if Drummond was the only one who could keep them safe? March brought thaw, but with it came something far colder than winter. Drummond's escalation. The disappearances had slowed, not because they stopped, because they changed. The next family, the Millers, didn't vanish. They remained. But they were not the same. Jonathan Miller had been one of the town's most vocal skeptics of Drummond, a hard man, a war veteran, and utterly unmovable in faith and reason. "No man ought to whisper inside another man's soul," he once said during a town gathering, and that professor's voice crawls into the places God left alone. A week later, Drummond offered to visit the Millers for spiritual consultation. Jonathan refused. 2 days after that, the Miller children were invited to the academy for a weekend youth enrichment. Only the eldest returned home Monday. Then came the lights. Neighbors reported a dull, flickering glow inside the Miller home at night, like lanterns, but pulsing, rhythmic. No music, no movement, just the light. By Thursday, Margaret Miller began walking the streets barefoot at dusk, muttering to herself in mirror language, syllables spoken backward, like a hymn in reverse. On Sunday, the town gathered to intervene. Brewster led a group of 7 to knock on the Miller door. It opened on its own. Inside, they found the family seated at the dining table, all 5, still, eyes closed, mouths slightly parted as though mid-prayer. In the center of the table sat a small wooden box, covered in red velvet, tied with twine. Drummond arrived minutes later. "Do not open it," he said, voice low. But Brewster, shaking, demanded to know what had been done. Drummond didn't argue. He only stared into Jonathan's vacant eyes and said one sentence. "Faith is a scaffold. Once it lifts you high enough, you must tear it down to see the sky." Then he turned and left. And that night, every member of the Miller family awoke screaming. Not in pain, not in fear, in ecstasy. Neighbors heard them praising the stars, whispering names no one recognized, laughing between sobs. The next day they resumed life, normal, polite, composed, except for their eyes, glassy, fixed, stripped of depth like glass marbles. They spoke kindly, greeted warmly. But something inside them had been scraped out and replaced. Drummond hadn't vanished this family. He had emptied them. And what moved in their place was no longer fully human. They say truth fears light, but in Hadley, truth feared the underground. By early April, the town's patience had frayed. The disappearances, the transformations, the eerie calm that felt more like paralysis than peace. Constable Brewster, once a quiet man of structure, had begun keeping his pistol close. He'd also begun drawing maps, tracking disappearances, odd sightings, even dreams reported by townsfolk. Every line pointed back to the same place, Drummond's academy, and beneath it, the basement. It wasn't on any blueprint. It didn't exist when the school was first built. But children whispered of a room below the floorboards, where some were taken after sessions. They spoke in half-memories, their voices thin with confusion and awe. "They teach you silence down there," one girl muttered, "but it sings to you when the candles go out." Brewster decided to investigate. He waited until midnight. The academy was dark. The storm that night helped muffle his footsteps. He broke in through the back, past the lecture hall, down the servant stair. The basement door was cleverly hidden, behind the bookshelf in Drummond's private office. A false spine, labelled A Treatise on Sound, unlocked it. What he found below did not belong to the 19th century. The room was circular, lined with obsidian stones that absorbed the lantern light. Symbols were carved along the floor, neither Latin nor Greek, but older, carved in spirals, repeating patterns, looping in on themselves like mines folding inward. In the center sat 6 wooden chairs, each facing outward, and behind each chair, a mirror. But these mirrors didn't reflect, not properly. When Brewster stepped into their line of sight, his image moved a second too slow. His reflection smiled when he did not. And then he saw them. In the far corner, 6 black robes folded neatly on a shelf. One bore a tag, M. Whitlock. Beside them, in glass jars, were teeth, human teeth, dozens, filed flat, arranged by size. Before he could move, a voice whispered from the dark, "You were never meant to come here." Drummond stepped from the shadows, not alarmed, not angry, just disappointed. "You've glimpsed the root, Constable, but roots are never the danger." He gestured upward, toward the school. "The fruit is already growing." Then everything went silent, not quiet, but void. No heartbeat, no thought. Brewster awoke in his home 2 days later, clothed, unharmed. But in the mirror, his eyes blinked out of sync. By May, Hadley had stopped asking questions. The disappearances continued, yes, but no longer with outrage. Whispers still flickered in private, but when spoken aloud, they were respectful, almost reverent, because something had shifted. People began referring to the missing as the Chosen. It started with the banker's wife, then the blacksmith, then the town clerk. Their names no longer appeared in church bulletins, but in a new ledger, kept quietly at the academy and updated in Drummond's hand. It was titled, "The Ascended, Those Who Heard the Interior Sound." No one recalled hearing this phrase before, but somehow they all recognized it. Brewster, still battling the fog in his thoughts since the basement, tried to warn the mayor. But the mayor, once a proud skeptic, now wore a silver ring marked with a symbol Brewster had seen in the basement, a spiral. "Order has returned to Hadley," the mayor said quietly. "You should be grateful." That week, the town held its first ceremony of stillness. It was not a funeral, nor a festival. It was held in silence. All shops closed, children stayed home. At sunset, everyone gathered in the town square. They stood shoulder to shoulder, hands clasped, faces forward, waiting. No one had told them to come. They just knew. Then, from the school's front steps, Drummond emerged. He wore no robe, no mask, just a simple black suit, tailored with sharp precision. He raised no hand, spoke no greeting. And yet, the entire crowd sank to their knees in unison. He opened a small book, read a passage no one recognized, and as he spoke, the townspeople began to sway, gently, rhythmically. Some wept, others hummed, though no melody played. Brewster tried to move, to interrupt, but his legs would not obey. And then the children began chanting, not in English, not in Latin, but in mirror speak, backward syllables, forming words that felt elemental. Drummond smiled, not with joy, but with confirmation, as if something long foretold had finally begun. The next day, Hadley's church bells rang once, backward. The pastor was gone, his shoes left behind at the altar. In their place, a message carved into the wood. The old shepherd has stepped aside. The new voice is clearer. And just like that, Drummond became more than a teacher. He became the town's spiritual anchor, not by force, by invitation. By summer, Drummond no longer referred to Hadley as a town. He called it a threshold, a place between fixed form and infinite self. His followers, once skeptical farmers, seamstresses and tradesmen, now called themselves Resonance. They wore dull grey garments, no buttons, no seams, only the spiral symbol stitched over the heart. And they began speaking less, smiling more, listening constantly. It was said they could hear something just beneath the wind, behind the birdsong, beneath the creak of every floorboard. They called it the deep note. It wasn't music, it was a presence. An instruction that pulsed through soil, bone and blood. Drummond claimed it had always existed, but man's obsession with language and ego had drowned it out. The interior convergence, he explained, was not an event. It was a surgery. Imagine peeling away everything you were told you are, he whispered during a twilight lecture. The names, the fears, the shape of your mind. What's left is something ancient, clean, and it hears the note perfectly. Preparations began. Townspeople started fasting in 3-day cycles. They turned mirrors to face the walls, covered clocks, removed doors from their homes. All architecture must be inward, Drummond said. Let your lives match your minds. They tore down the church steeple, replaced it with a black obelisk carved from local stone. No inscriptions, no windows, just a smooth, tapering structure that absorbed sunlight. At its base, a circular chamber, modelled after the basement of the academy. 6 chairs, 6 mirrors, and in the centre, a table of bone. The town physician, Dr. Felix Rowan, resigned. He was last seen kneeling before the obelisk at dawn, humming with his mouth sewn shut. His replacement, a young student of Drummond, trained not in medicine but in internal geometry. He carried no instruments, only a wood-ease box filled with red velvet and twine. The children now learned reverse speech as part of their curriculum. They no longer painted nature, they painted shapes, endless spirals, closed eyes, dismembered mouths, and no one complained, because the fear was gone. Replaced by something worse, anticipation. Whatever the convergence was, Hadley was ready. The soil was tilled, the minds were cleared, the bodies were obedient. And Drummond? He no longer walked, he glided. They called it the first hollowing. It happened on August the 3rd, beneath a pale sky that seemed somehow closer than usual. The subject was 19-year-old Micah Rourke, a quiet, obedient boy from the edge of town, never known for brilliance, but never known for trouble either. Vanilla in a world now starved of flavor. He stepped forward during the weekly stillness assembly and spoke just one sentence. I no longer require my outer voice. The crowd didn't react with shock. They applauded. Drummond emerged from the obelisk, dressed in robes this time, stitched with spirals that moved subtly when he breathed. Behind him, 6 followers carried the table of bone. Micah lay down without hesitation. His mother wept, but never protested. The ceremony began with a whisper, Drummond speaking directly into Micah's ear. No one else heard the words. They weren't meant to. Then came the tools. Not steel, not medical. They were crafted, smooth instruments made from black wood, bone, and something iridescent no one could name. First, the silencing needle. It didn't pierce skin, it touched the tongue. And as it did, Micah let out one final sound, a gasping note, neither pain nor relief. Then silence. Not forced, total. The followers stitched his mouth, not tightly, but with just enough pressure to discourage reversal. But the true hollowing came after. Micah stood, calm, upright, and began to speak. His mouth never moved. The voice filled the square, not loud, but heavy. It bypassed ears and landed inside the mind. It was not Micah's voice. It was deeper, colder, older. The crowd wept, some collapsing. A woman convulsed. A child stared upward and whispered, I see the inside. Drummond raised his hand. The voice stopped. Micah bowed, then walked to the academy, never looking back. He would never speak again, not with his lips. But when Drummond needed the note, Delivered clearly, Micah would appear. He became a vessel, not possessed, not brainwashed, rewritten. From that day forward, hollowing became a path for the faithful, a graduation, and Hadley was no longer afraid of it. They were eager. Young men began fasting. Girls painted spirals on their own eyelids. Parents encouraged their children to listen to the inner sound instead of speaking their dreams. Speech became selfish. Silence became sacred. And Drummond? He declared the first hollowing a success, but warned the town, what comes next will require more than your voice. It will require your history. There was no ceremony this time, no warning, just silence. It began one rainy morning when 6 children were found wandering near the riverbed, confused, shivering, mute. When asked who they were, none could answer. Not one name, not their own, not their parents, not even Hadley. Their clothes were familiar, their faces were known, but when townsfolk tried to help them remember, the children screamed, not out of pain, but repulsion, as if names burned like fire. The local archivist, Irene Calloway, pulled the family registers to find their identities. But every page bearing their surnames, Chalmers, Rourke, Bedloe, had been torn out, not ripped, excised. The ink itself faded from the parchment. It wasn't vandalism. It was surgical. Drummond called it the harvest of names, and according to him, it was long overdue. You cling to bloodlines like anchors, he told the gathering crowd, but memory is a prison, ancestry is a cage. You cannot reach the infinite by dragging the dead with you. No one argued, not even the elders, because something had changed in the air, something psychic. It was as if speaking a surname caused static behind the eyes, as if trying to remember your mother's maiden name made your heart race and your pupils dilate. And then, just like that, it stopped mattering. People began referring to each other by function, the baker, the one who listens, the mirror child, the second hollowed. Even lovers stopped using pet names. Even parents forgot the names they had once whispered into cribs. And what filled the void? Nothing. And that was the point. Drummond's philosophy reached a new height. The individual is obsolete. The spiral does not care for pronouns. The town graveyard was leveled. Markers shattered, stones ground to powder and fed to the soil. Families watched it happen and did not protest. They stood hand in hand and smiled as their own legacies were buried beyond recovery. Some even asked to be forgotten while still alive. They lined up to have their names scraped from church logs, school registers, marriage documents. And the final step? The obelisk began to hum, faint, rhythmic, like breathing. The deep note was no longer something you heard. It was something you became. And Hadley was now a town of ghosts without tombstones, walking, working, living, and utterly detached from identity itself. There are no doors on the obelisk, no hinges, no handles, no seams. For 32 years, no one in Hadley ever saw it open, until the night of the third hollowing. Rain was falling, not from the sky, but from the ground, mist rising upward like reversed gravity, swallowing the town in fog so thick it suffocated the stars. At precisely 3:03 a.m., the obelisk cracked, not with sound but with light. A vertical slit blinked into being, bright and wet like the eye of something waking up, and Drummond stepped forward, robe soaked, arms open. The people of Hadley did not cheer, they knelt. Even the hollowed, whose mouths were sewn shut, let out soundless screams, ecstasy or terror, it was impossible to say. And then, the chosen were summoned. 12 boys, 12 girls, each age 13. Drummond called them the 12s of unknowing. They were led barefoot across the wet earth. Not a single one cried, not one hesitated, because they'd been prepared for this since birth. No names, no mirrors, no photographs, no birthdays. Raised on silence, darkness, and spiraled chants. They entered the obelisk without resistance, and the slit closed behind them like a wound healing. What happened inside? That question died quickly in Hadley. Because when the obelisk reopened 12 hours later, only 6 children came out. Their eyes were black, not bruised, not colored. Gone. And when they walked, their feet didn't touch the ground. They hovered half an inch above it, weightless, frictionless, like dreams in physical form. Their presence made men forget their wives. Women drop their infants. Dogs howl until blood leaked from their ears. Drummond called them the silent custodians. They did not speak, but they remembered everything you forgot. They moved through Hadley like shadows, collecting words, memories, objects, removing things from existence piece by piece. And every time they did, the obelisk grew, inch by inch, as if fed. What's inside the obelisk? Here's what the 12s never told us, because they couldn't. Language fails inside those walls. One survivor, Mary Ellen Dorr, escaped the town in 1871. She had aged 50 years in 5 minutes. Her final words? The obelisk doesn't hold secrets. It is the secret. And every time you look away, it gets closer. Then her eyes liquefied in her skull, and she smiled as she died. They called it the cleansing fire. It was Hadley's last attempt to purge the spiral, to sever the town from the obelisk. But rebellion by this point was like whispering into a hurricane, because the moment you formed the thought of resistance, the custodians would appear. They didn't punish. They didn't speak. They simply stood there, watching. And something about being seen by them made your knees buckle, your breath shorten, your spine forget how to stay straight. Still, some tried. Led by Saul Bexley, a third-generation blacksmith and one of the few men left who still remembered his own name, he gathered the fragments, pages from the church's original hymnal, splinters of wood from the pre-spiral pews, flint soaked in lamb's blood. The fire was set on the last Sabbath of 1872. At the base of the obelisk, it was not a blaze. It was an inferno. The townsfolk watched from porches, unsure whether to scream or sing. The flames rose 30 feet high, and for one brief, shuddering moment, the obelisk cracked. Not physically, psychically. Witnesses described it differently. One said they saw the face of a weeping child on its surface. Another saw their dead mother, mouth sewn shut. One woman screamed that she saw her own unborn thoughts burning inside it. And then, silence. Not quiet. Total silence. The flames froze mid-air, hanging like fire painted onto glass. And then, they reversed. The fire was sucked backward into the obelisk's core. Every ember, every ash, every intention, even Saul Bexley's shadow was pulled from the ground and devoured. The rebellion ended with no blood, no bodies, just emptiness. But that emptiness grew. In the days that followed, people forgot they had ever tried to fight. The blacksmith's forge vanished. The hymnal's pages re-inked themselves with spiral verses, and children began drawing circles with eyes in the dirt. Even the weather changed. Rain no longer fell, it listened, because the spiral had evolved. Resistance had been digested, and what came next was something Hadley had no word for, because Hadley no longer had words. Just the obelisk, and the hum, and a memory of rebellion that no one remembered, except for a voice buried in the soil beneath the church floorboards. You can still hear it if you go to the old Hadley church ruins today, not with your ears, with your nervous system. Beneath the floorboards, long since rotted away, there's a vibration, faint, pulsing, like something breathing through the stone, and it's speaking, not in language, in invitation. That's where Drummond's final writings were hidden. They weren't in his study, not in his books, but scratched by fingernail beneath the pulpit floor under layers of dried blood and scorched dust. The last entry was dated December 9th, 1873. The voice beneath has grown teeth. I do not speak to it anymore. It speaks to me. According to what remains, Drummond once believed he controlled the spiral, that he had uncovered a science of obedience, a formula to bypass identity, free will, even the self. But the deeper he went, the more he realized he was not the author. He was being dictated to by something older than humanity's oldest trauma, something that lived beneath the idea of language itself. He called it the root, and the root had one desire: to be remembered. That was the true horror. The spiral didn't erase memory, it rewrote it. It reshaped the past. People didn't forget what happened in Hadley. They remembered it wrong. They believed the obelisk was always there, that the custodians were church volunteers, that the town's silence was peace. But Drummond? He saw it, and by the end, he feared it. His writings became fragmented, scrawled with backward phrases, drawings of faces with mouths replaced by ears. One line repeated 17 times in blood: "The word is coming. The word is us." Then silence. Except, not quite. There were reports, years later, from wanderers who stumbled into the ruins, people who said they heard whispers in their bones. Some fled, screaming they'd forgotten their own names. Others knelt. And one, he stayed, started carving spirals into his own chest, sobbing, smiling, saying, "I remember now. I remember what it was before we were human." Because that's the truth Drummond unearthed. The spiral wasn't a curse. It was a return to something we were meant to be before thought, before identity, before the lie of free will. The custodians were never born, not in any human sense. They had names once, but those were burned out piece by obedience rituals designed to sterilize the soul. Their first task was simple: to watch, not to enforce, not to kill, just to observe, until people forgot how to move unless watched. But by 1875, Hadley no longer needed watchers. The town watched itself. Even babies, born into spiral-lit silence, cried only when alone. And so the custodians were given a final purpose. Not by Drummond, not by the root, by the system itself. Because once obedience becomes instinct, the mechanism must evolve. And so they began to change. Their limbs thinned, their eyes sealed shut, their mouths vanished entirely. What replaced them was gesture, ritual motion repeated endlessly, not for meaning, but for momentum. One turned in circles at the edge of town for 40 years. Another lay flat in the church for a decade, face down, twitching in rhythm to a silent clock. People who passed too near were said to fall behind their own breath, their lungs forgetting when to inhale. And yet, the custodians were not feared. They were revered. Even after Drummond's death, townsfolk brought them offerings: pieces of cloth, broken toys, animal bones wrapped in scripture, and eventually something unspoken became tradition. If a child wandered off-path, they were left with the custodians overnight. They'd return changed, quiet, composed, eyes always a little too wide. Some never spoke again, but none disobeyed, because by that time, Hadley wasn't a town anymore. It was a system in flesh, a ritual with buildings and roads and people as its components, and when something is designed well enough, it doesn't need creators. The spiral didn't die with Drummond, because it had become self-sustaining, a closed loop of silence, memory corruption, and obedience. He encoded into architecture, into family bloodlines, into the land itself. The custodians' task was complete, but their bodies remained. Some say they still roam, deep in the woods beyond what's left of Hadley. No eyes, no voice, only presence. And if you see one, don't run, don't speak, just bow. Because they remember what you were supposed to forget. He wasn't supposed to find it. Thomas Elridge wasn't a scholar, he wasn't a mystic, he was a plumber from Ohio whose car broke down 40 miles south of nowhere in the summer of 1959. But Hadley calls who it needs. And on the third day of walking without direction, Thomas stumbled into a clearing that wasn't there a moment before. He said the air folded sideways, that the trees leaned away from something they couldn't see. And then he saw the door. Not a building, just a black doorframe, freestanding in the wild grass. No walls, no hinges, just the shape of entry, without invitation. His notes, discovered years later in a rest stop bathroom 400 miles away, described what came next. The door opened into an absence, a nothing with spine. I stepped into something that felt like remembering a room I'd never seen before. Inside wasn't darkness. It was indexing. Shelves stacked to the sky filled with books that weren't. No titles, no covers, just blank volumes vibrating faintly in the hand, as if trying to resist being held. Thomas said the pages changed depending on who turned them. One man might see scripture, another blueprints for unspeakable machines. He saw himself, but not the self he knew. He saw thoughts he'd never admitted out loud, desires he had buried, moments he forgot on purpose. Each book a reflection of someone's silence. Hadley hadn't just trained obedience, it had created a psychic archive of suppression. Every time someone swallowed the truth, every time a child chose not to scream, every dream that died in a quiet man's chest, Hadley kept it, filed it, indexed it, because knowledge isn't power, suppressed knowledge is. That archive wasn't built by hands, it was built by cost. And Thomas? He tried to leave with a page, just one, folded neatly in his pocket. He made it 20 steps beyond the door before his legs collapsed. His lungs filled with other people's screams. He was found days later, alive, sobbing, covered in ink that wouldn't wash off. On his back, scratched in his own fingernails, were the words, "What was never said still lives." The archive couldn't be removed, because it wasn't in Hadley. It was Hadley. The U.S. Census of 1890 lists Hadley Township as dissolved, no residents, no structures, no taxes, gone, clean as a signature burned from a ledger. But if that's true, why did the Department of Education use Model H Hadley 4C for rural behavior programs until 1967? Why do dozens of internal memos across 3 federal agencies reference the Hadley Compliance Framework in redacted behavioral control trials? Why do prisoners in multiple states, including men born a century apart, still whisper about a punishment called the spiral room? Because Hadley didn't disappear. It dispersed. You must understand, Hadley was never meant to survive as a place. It was a template, a prototype of controlled belief, and once it worked, they didn't need the town. They just needed its logic. So they scattered it. Not all at once, but slowly, methodically, a teaching method here, a church design there, a prison architecture blueprint, accidentally circulated across counties. Pieces of Hadley turned up in Alabama school districts, Vermont reform camps, and covert psychiatric labs in northern Michigan. Even the name faded, not by suppression, but through replacement. No one questions a rule they grew up inside, and so the spiral became policy. The silence became manners. The custodian posture, head down, unmoving, became detention protocol in at least 5 states. You see, the goal was never secrecy. The goal was distribution without awareness. Because if you knew you were living inside Hadley, you might resist it. But if you think it's just the way things are, you become your own jailer. Drummond's genius wasn't in manipulation, it was in scalability. He created a virus of thought, a mimetic control system, something that spreads not by force, but by social inheritance. A town dies in the record books, but the idea of it, the discipline it instilled, that survives. And here's the final horror. Even the people who shut Hadley down kept using it. Because if you want order, if you want control, if you want compliance without violence, you don't invent a new system, you franchise the old one. Hadley didn't end. It went global. And you, right now, sitting here listening, you've already lived in parts of it. That's why the spiral feels familiar. Because it is. You've been led to believe that Hadley was a unique event, a twisted outlier of American history. But what if Hadley was only one node of something much older? What if the spiral wasn't created by Professor Drummond at all, but merely revived? In 1819, 5 years before Hadley officially took shape, Ezekiel Drummond spent 8 months in a region of southern France, known then only by its Latin name, Atrum Orbis, the Dark Circle. There are no letters from that period, no journals, only an undocumented shift in his demeanor noted by his peers when he returned. One student wrote, his voice had changed, not in pitch, but in intent. It was as if he no longer spoke to teach, but to install. What Drummond brought back from Atrum Orbis was not information, it was method. You see, the spiral is prehistoric. Cave systems beneath that French valley, sealed for over 8,000 years, contained symbols nearly identical to the spiral mural Drummond later had painted beneath Hadley's schoolhouse. Archaeologists thought it was coincidence, but they never explained why each spiral in those caves was surrounded by sets of tally marks, always in sevens, just like Hadley's 7 behavioral layers. Worse, those caves weren't burial grounds. They were containment chambers. The deeper you go, the more walls curve inward, as if leading the mind, not the body, toward a conclusion it never consented to reach. Just like Hadley. You think Drummond was a visionary? No, he was a reactivator. A man who found a system etched into human fear thousands of years before modern society existed. A design so powerful it survived epochs of fire, ice, war, and language extinction, and now it survives inside you. How do I know? Because the spiral isn't just architecture, it's a cognitive structure, an interior hallway, and once you've been exposed to it, through sight, sound, story, or even suggestion, your thoughts begin to rearrange themselves. You think you're listening right now, but your mind is already mapping the hallway. And at the center is a room that isn't meant to be opened, but the spiral is patient. It always grows inward, and if you're still here, you're already walking it. They told you the room was sealed, that the spiral was theoretical, that Ezekiel Drummond died alone, mad and irrelevant. But the spiral doesn't care about death, it cares about completion. And completion isn't an ending. It's a hand on your shoulder. It's a voice inside your head that speaks with your voice. Because the final room was never locked. It was always inside you. Here's the truth. Drummond didn't just build a system. He installed a recursion, a repeating pattern that activates when you try to understand it. A cognitive infection that loops, tightens, sharpens with every attempt to escape. You weren't warned about Hadley because Hadley was never meant to be escaped. It was meant to be exported. Each time someone hears the story, they think they're observing history, but they're not. They're replicating it. You thought this was a documentary. It's not. It's a mechanism. And now it's in you. There are whispers archived in 1932 field recordings from Kansas prison systems, inmates repeating phrases in old Hadley dialect, the exact words Drummond used to induct his students. The phrases match verbatim what children in modern reform camps chant during focus hour. Same cadence, same spiral. You see, Hadley was never a place. It was a blueprint for self-erasure. And Drummond? He didn't fail. He succeeded beyond control, and when it grew too dangerous, too pure, too effective, they didn't destroy it. They institutionalized it. Like all dangerous truths, they buried it in plain process. The school rules you memorized as a kid, the quiet voice you use in waiting rooms, The feeling that if you just obey a little harder, you'll finally be safe. That's the spiral talking, and it's still turning. So now you have a choice. Walk out. Forget this. Call it fiction, or admit what you already know, that some part of you recognizes this pattern that you've felt Hadley before, in your church, in your classroom, in your family, and now in yourself. You want to know what's in the final room? You already do, because you've always been standing in it. The question is, will you stay there, or finally walk out, before the door seals shut again? You want to understand power? Then study the men who never needed to raise their voices, only their eyebrows. Ezekiel Drummond wasn't just a teacher, he was a mirror. And if you're still watching, maybe you saw something of yourself in him. What's next? You look into your own history, and pray you don't find a man like Drummond buried in it.